Hi, I'm Scott from the Rio Grande Tech Team, and today I'm going to show you how to make bezel settings in ZBrush using the ZModeler brush. So let's get started. Okay, so I've got ZBrush booted up, and the first thing we need to do is we need to bring in a subtool. And it really doesn't matter which one we bring in. We're going to be using one of the primitives within the Gizmo 3D. So I'm actually going to choose this star here, this Polymesh 3D, and go ahead and click on that. Left click and drag, and immediately hit the T key to go into edit mode. Now, since we're doing a bezel setting, we're also going to need a stone. So I'm actually going to use the Ring Utility plugin. So under the Z plugin menu is the Ring Utility. If you don't have this installed with your version of ZBrush, I do highly recommend it. That's available at pixelogic.com under their Z plugins page. And this is a great little utility for making rings, and it also has the ability to generate gemstones. So in Ring Utility, I'm going to click on the Gemstones submenu. And we're just going to leave this at default. We're going to do a 4mm stone round. I don't want it on the band because we're not actually generating a ring, so I'm going to go ahead and uncheck that and then click Add Gemstone Subtool. So first thing I need to do is I need to size this and make sure that it's correct. So in my subtool palette, I'm going to make sure that I have the stone selected, and I'm going to go down to my geometry palette and open up the size menu. And in the XYZ, this is a 4mm, so I'm going to key in 4 and enter. There we go. So there is our stone. Now I'm going to go back to the subtool palette and select my star, and I'm going to open up the gizmo by selecting either move, scale, or rotate. And the first thing I'm going to do, it's kind of small at the moment, I'm just going to scale it up until it's about the same size just by clicking and dragging on the yellow square there. And the primitive we're going to use within the gizmo is here in the Customize button on the left. So go ahead and click that. And the one that we're looking for is the Cylinder 3D. So go ahead and click on that as well. Now, when it comes in, it's in the wrong orientation. So let's go ahead and let's adjust that first. My gear icon here for Customize, go ahead and click on that. And you'll see at the top of the window here, we've got our cylinder and our gizmo, so we can go back and forth. So click on the Gizmo 3D, and I'm going to hold Shift to lock it into this side view, and I'm going to turn it 90 degrees. So left click on this outer circle, hold Shift until we've turned it 90 degrees. There we go. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to move it down a little bit. We are going to be scaling this up a little bit, but we do want the cylinder to be underneath at this point in time. So I'm going to go to my top view and grab the yellow square here, left click and drag, and we're going to bring this out. Now, this is the point when we're going to be making our bezel wall thickness. So if you want to get real exact with the thickness of your bezel, you could actually append in a cube and size it to a certain size. Like say you wanted your bezel to be, let's say 0.7 millimeters thick, for instance. You could actually append that into your scene and use that as a size reference for how thick you want this bezel to be. For this exercise, I'm just going to be eyeballing it at this point. So I just want to scale this in or out to get a bezel wall thickness that looks pretty good. And based on the size of this stone, which is a 4mm, I'd guess this is probably around the 0.6, somewhere in that area. So that will be pretty good. So now we can make a few adjustments to this cylinder before we go into ZModeler. So I'm going to go back into the Customize area and select my Cylinder 3D. Now with this cylinder, we have a few options to choose from. So the first one is when we look at our cylinder, you can see it's very low poly. We're at about 50 points for this. and it's a bit jagged on the outside edge. We want to smooth that out just a bit. We don't want to add too much geometry because then that just makes our work in ZModeler a little more laborious. So up here I've got a red and I've got a green cone, and I'll turn on polyframes so you can see this a little better. So this is what's going to allow me to add more geometry. So your V divide is going to add more of these loops right here. So you can kind of see if I click and drag on that. We don't need them in that orientation. We need to grab the other one. So H divide, we're going to grab it, and I'm going to look at it from the top while I do this, and just add some so it's a bit more roundish. And that is actually fine right there. That will suit our purposes just fine. You don't have to add a whole bunch. So the next thing we need to do is, and this is one of the reasons why I prefer to use this primitive inside the gizmo, is that we have this other cone down here for inner radius. So if I left click and drag on that, you can see I can actually basically create my bezel wall just by clicking and dragging on this. Now we want to drag it until it's just outside the edge of the stone. Our stone is a bit blocky here. In reality it'll be a bit smoother, but we want to go ahead and drag that bezel wall out until it is cleared of the stone, just as close as you can get it. Okay, so one final adjustment we're going to make. We are going to go back into Customize and go back into our Gizmo 3D. This bezel's kind of long at the moment, so we need to kind of shorten it up, and we need to get it in the right placement in relation to this stone. So I'm going to take the Scale Z little rectangle here and click and drag just to kind of scale this down just a bit. And in order to get the right orientation, down here I'm going to click on transparent mode, or activate edit opacity. So now when we start moving this up by grabbing on this z-axis cone up here, I'll be able to place this right where I want to in relation to the stone. Now the height that we want to shoot for is we want the top edge of this bezel to be about 60% up of the crown. So on the stone we have the girdle, which is the widest part, we have the table, which is the top, and everything in between is considered the crown. From here to here we want this top bezel to be about 60% up, just for modeling purposes. When this is actually cast and set, there's going to be a lot of leeway with the setter, or if you're doing the setting yourself, by bringing the top of this bezel wall down, cutting the seat a little deeper if needed. There's a lot of leeway there, so you don't have to worry about being too exact in this instance. So there we go. So now we're going to go into draw mode, get the gizmo away, and now we can go into the ZModeler brush because we're ready to use it. So on my keyboard I'm going to hit the B, Z, and then M for ZModeler. And here we go. So kind of a quick introduction into ZModeler. It is used for really low poly models to make quick adjustments. So as I take my cursor and I hover over one of these polys, I can press and hold the space bar, and it brings up a large number of options. So here are the actions I can take on each one of these polys, a target for which polys I want to change, and then there's a selection of modifiers down here. Now, but that also applies to these edges and the points. So each one of those has unique attributes that you can change. So if I hover over one of these edge loops, same thing. I have a number of edge actions and targets. So the first thing we need to do is, right now our bezel is basically just a tube. So we need to create a seat for it, or else that stone's going to fall all the way down. So the first thing I'm going to do is I need to create an edge loop on the inside here. And the way we're going to do that, I'm going to zoom in a little bit just so I can see it a little better. And I'm going to hover over one of these edges on the inside. Now you can see the message just below my cursor where by default it says Insert Edge Loop, Alt to delete edge loop, and Shift constant width. We just need to create an edge loop. So we'll hover over this edge, left click and drag, and I want to bring this edge loop down, and I'm just going to ballpark it right now. I want to be just under the girdle of that stone, and then release. We're actually going to check this just to make sure that we have the proper depth. It's a little tricky to kind of see where it's landing, but we can always adjust it later if necessary. So I'm going to go into my top view and hold Shift to snap into that position. And off to the side, I'm going to press and hold Control, Shift, and Alt all at once, and then click and drag this box out. And that will hide that section of the bezel. And now I can look at it from the side here and see if I got my edge loop where I wanted it. And that looks good. That's right where I want to be. You want to be under this girdle edge right here because our seat is going to come along this edge. You just don't want to be even with the girdle or even slightly above it. If you find that you need to do it again, just Control Z back to the point where the edge loop disappears and then do it again. Keep in mind, it's the same thing as before. You don't have to be super exact with this because once the person setting the stone goes in to set it and cut the seat, there's a lot of leeway there to set the stone a tad deeper, or there's some fudge room there. So since that looks good, to get my bezel back, I'm going to hold Control and Shift and click off to the side, and that will bring it back. So now I don't need the stone for a bit, so I'm going to go into my subtool palette and click on the eye to turn it off. Now we need to grab these polys on the inside, and we're going to extrude them out to make our seat. But first we need to do one thing. We need to create a new polygroup in these bottom edges. And you can see by adding that edge loop, we've actually separated out these polys. So I'm going to hover over one of these polys, and I'm going to press and hold spacebar. And in my polygon actions, I'm going to select polygroup. And for targets, I'm just going to do a single poly. Since we kept the geometry pretty low, it only takes a sec. And now we can just click on these polys and add a new polygroup to those. So I'm gonna work my way around here, and there we go. So now I have a new polygroup created on the inside there. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to pull this polygroup in and make ourselves a seat. So I'm going to hover back over my poly here, press and hold spacebar, and I'm going to select Q Mesh. Under Targets, I'm going to select Polygroup All, and that's all we need to change. So now when I click and hold on one of these polys and drag it in, now I'm creating a seat because we Q-mesh, think of Q-mesh more like an extrusion, and we told the Q-mesh that we wanted it to extract the entire polygroup. So now we have a seat that goes all the way around. Now, if you're going to be setting a stone, like a cabochon, for instance, then this is actually the kind of seat you would want to have. It's actually flat on the top, as you can see. So if you're working with like a flat back cabochon, then this is actually where you'd want to be. You wouldn't have to make any of the future adjustments that we're going to be making. If you're working with cabochons a lot, then this would be something to save. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is, since we're working with a faceted stone, if I bring my stone in, and I'm going to do the same cutaway technique that we did before, so Control, Shift, and Alt. and then click and drag. We need to bring this edge in a bit because right now it's intruding into the stone. We need to try to make it even with this edge here. Bring back my bezel, Control Shift and click. And by the way, if you're hiding something and trying to make adjustments to it while you have a portion of it hidden, any changes that you make will not apply to the hidden part, just in case you're wondering. So you will always have to bring that back into the scene. Okay, so I'm going to hide my stone by clicking on the eye in the subtool menu, and I'm going to hover over this inner edge here. I'm going to press and hold spacebar, and I'm going to select Move Infinite Radius, and for target, I'm going to make sure it says Edge Loop Complete. So what that means is it will, as I grab one of these edges, it will apply that to all of these edges. So I'm going to hover over this edge, I'm going to left click and drag, and you can see I can bring that down, but right now it can kind of shimmy left or right. So while you still have the mouse button held down, hold Shift, and that will kind of lock it into place. And I'm going to drag this down and just kind of guess on where that needs to be. Because again, we're going to clip the side out of the way so we can see exactly where we need to be. So now I can bring my stone back into the scene. So go to my top view, Control Shift Alt, and click and drag. And now I can check it from the side view to see. And that looks pretty much perfect. If you find that you didn't come far enough, you don't have to Control Z or anything. Just grab that same edge again and bring it down a bit more. Grab on that edge loop again, make sure to hold Shift and bring that up or down as necessary. But that's good. I like where that's at, so I'm going to keep it there. Okay, so bring the bezel back into the scene. So Control Shift and click, and now we have our seat. So the next thing that I like to do, this is my personal preference. You don't have to do this, but this is something that I've always preferred to do. We're going to make a little bevel on this top edge here, because when we go to set this, if we have this kind of corner of metal here sticking up, then we've got more metal that we have to move to get the stone secure. So if I create a bevel along this edge, then the burnisher that I'm using or the stone setting punch or whatever you're using, it will seat a lot better and the metal will actually move faster and secure the stone. I'm going to hover over this outside edge and I'm going to press and hold spacebar, and under Edge Actions I'm going to select Bevel, and again make sure that Edge Loop Complete is selected, and then release spacebar. So now I can click and drag on this outside edge and make a little bevel there. So that's looking pretty good. I'm really liking how this is turning out. So I want to show you something real quick. If you are following along, you don't have to do this next step, but I do want you to watch. Our bezel pretty much looks complete. Now let's say we were going to add this onto our piece, and right now it's still really low poly. We're at 192 active points. So if I go into my geometry tab, I'm going to turn off polyframes for this, and I'm also going to hide the stone so you can see this a little better. Now when I start subdividing this, watch what happens. I'm going to click Subdivide, and you can see all my details just got rounded off. It's actually looking closer to a bead at this point. So there's one more thing that we want to do to make sure that this doesn't happen when we start subdividing and adding geometry to kind of smooth everything out. So I'm going to Control Z a couple times and get back to my original bezel. I'm going to turn polyframes back on. And I'm going to do one modification to these edges. So I'm going to hover over one of these edges, press and hold spacebar, and I'm going to select Crease. And for target, I want to select Edge Loop Complete. Now what creasing is going to do is it's going to keep whatever edges I've applied creasing to, it will keep them nice and sharp. So I want to apply creasing on this inner loop here, and you can barely see it, but it's created a little dotted line on either side of my edge loop. And because we selected Edge Loop Complete, it went all the way around. So I want to do that on these other edges as well. So I don't have to press spacebar because it's already selected. I can just click on the edge loop. So click on that one, and we're going to do this one, and we're also going to do the bottom ones as well. So there's that one and that one. Now that I've applied creasing to these edges, it will keep all of these edges nice and sharp, but these other edges down here, like along here, these edges, those are going to get smoothed out. So I'll turn off polyframes, and I'm going to hit divide a couple times. So now you can see that the outside edge, this edge up here, these up here, all of that is getting smoothed out, but it's keeping my corners nice and sharp. So now this is pretty much ready to go. I would recommend that in the instance where you need to make any kind of adjustments, I'm going to Control Z to get back to my original. Go ahead and save it like this in case you need to make any adjustments. A side note, once you have this made, you can actually save this up here in the tool palette as a Z tool. So you can bring this into your scene with other pieces that you're making, and it's going to save everything that we did, including the creasing. So as soon as you bring this in, if you need to make any adjustments with ZModeler, you can, and then when you start subdividing, it's going to be nice and smooth. And another nice part is that when you save this as a Z tool, you can always scale it up to a different size. So if you're doing an 8mm or a 10mm or what have you, you can take this same setting and scale it up to the size stone that you need. Okay, so that's pretty much it. That is kind of a quick and dirty way on how to make a bezel setting within ZBrush using the ZModeler tool. So if you have any questions, always feel free to contact us.